I'd like to invite Karthika to deliver her lecture.
I just spent the whole day literally at Koshi's down the road with a couple of most brilliant men, I think, who've both spoken here before. And my head is full of their stories about cricket, about politics, about Shashi Tharoor and various other interesting things. Ram Guha and Suresh Menon, both. And I've completely blanked out on what I intended or thought I should speak to you about. But so I'm going to actually speak about what comes to my head at this point about publishing and writing. And I want to start by saying thank you, because it is an honor to be here. I've been hearing about the class, and I've been to one of them a year ago, and we had a little session about writing, but mostly about marketing books at that point. When people talk about publishing, I mean, people who are not within the industry, a lot of the time they say things like, oh, you're an editor. You spend all your day surrounded by books. You're always reading. You're so lucky. It's like a job where, you just pick up a book and then you read it and then you have some coffee and then you go home, and magically manuscripts that are sent in get transformed into books that get published. There is, I think, very little awareness that there's a whole lot of work that goes into that process of getting the manuscript into a book in the stores. At the same time, we're also constantly told that, especially nowadays, that editors and publishers really should be a little bit more careful, because aren't we supposed to be monitoring quality? Aren't we supposed to be filters? Aren't we supposed to not publish books of a certain kind by certain kinds of writers? So isn't it our job to be responsible gatekeepers of quality and literature? And over again, the defensiveness comes out when publishers and editors talk about this to people. I hear the usual hitbacks of, but it's a business. We also have to make some money. We also have to make some profits. We also have to pay our staff. And there's so much else that has to be done as a business that includes making choices about what you publish, which is not necessarily one kind of thing, but something that can appeal to a cross-section of readers across the country, across the world. So as many kinds of readers as there are going to be that many books. And we're not exactly, our job is not to stop people from reading certain kinds of things. Our job is to facilitate reading and make sure that whatever they want to read, to a certain degree, I'm sure there are limits that we would place on our own ability to bring out those kinds of books, but it's not our job to stop people from reading what they want to read. But increasingly, a lot of us also ask ourselves, why are we bothering with publishing at all, publishing books? I don't know about you, but I'm fairly sure that a lot of people who went to bed with a book in the past now go to bed with a phone or a tablet. I'm sure that the last thing they do is not read a book, but to check what everyone else is doing on Facebook or what Twitter has to say about something. It's certainly not about, oh, what should I read today? And let me go back to that novel that I picked up 2 days ago. They really are more interested in identity that they can project on social media. They're interested in talking about things that make them feel that they're making a difference to the world. If I say something about the Rohingya tragedy, I am contributing by speaking up. And I feel very important. I feel like I've done something satisfactory before going to bed. I'm not picking up the book. And people like us, there are 3 of us here who are editors, there are literary agents here, there are writers here. There are times when you go back home and you say, why am I doing this? Why am I publishing books nobody wants to read? I mean, you spend 2 years sometimes with a writer. The writer's taken 5 years to write a book. You take 2 years to get it into a shape where it's publishable, not because the writer's a bad writer, but because that's a process of publishing. And at the end of the day, a few hundred people will read it, a few thousand people might read it if you're lucky, and that's it. So is there any point in this? When you yourself are reading less and less and less, and I think this is an admission that, again, all of us will make. We read a lot of manuscripts, but do we read enough books that we really want to read? Much less. And yet there are more and more easy ways to access books. There's Amazon, there's Flipkart, there's all kinds of stores all around you to tempt you to buy books. And yet fewer people are going in to discover these books. So then you ask yourself, if you didn't have a book, what would it be like? And you say, what do I get from a book that I don't get from anything else? You know, if I were thinking about it, then the words that would come to mind are pleasure, first and foremost, perspective, complexity, isolation and solitude, I suppose, not isolation, solitude, and a way for me to examine my own thoughts without mediation, for me to read a story and come away feeling good about it, for me to read a line of verse and say, I didn't know that, or a sudden illumination of something that I thought of as maybe vacuum, maybe darkness, and suddenly there's meaning there. And then suddenly you say, but I get all of this only from a book. I do not get this from any other form of creative consumption, if you want to call it that. And if I am so lucky as to spend my whole day working with books that give me all of this, then surely there's a reason beyond the obvious of selling and buying and making money. And so you decide that, well, actually publishing is well worth it, and this is an ecosystem you really, really want to belong to. And this is also the truth that just as writers often say they cannot not write, I think editors cannot not edit. We could possibly do other things, but once you're an editor in a publishing house, I don't think any of us is even capable of thinking of leaving. We just keep going on, and we just keep complaining sometimes about the difficulty of it all. But we go on because you cannot think of another way of life. Your writers are your life at some point. Your books are your life. And to work with writers to be friends with them, to have relationships with them that last well beyond the book, those are reasons that just make you feel rich every day, emotionally satisfied. And you just want to grow that set of relationships and make that the reason for your work life. And so we're fortunate. We're fortunate to be in that space. And we're fortunate to have you thinking about writing and writing books, which hopefully someday we will work with and help make more of. And that's really the way I think publishing has become for all of us, a way of life that we would not and cannot do without. But when I look back I've been an editor for 20 years now, and to spend time in the company of words in this way is enormously satisfying. But at the end of the day, you've also got to make it work, right? Because you're working in a company, you've got to make it sell, you've got to make money out of it, you've got to satisfy the people who invested in your company. And Indian publishing, I think, has come a long way. The English language publishing is what I'm going to primarily refer to. About 20 years ago, I think we had not only fewer publishers, but also fewer opportunities to sell and to talk about books. Remember, this is a time when there's no email, there's no phones except fixed landlines. You don't have access to publishers and agents and writers outside of your own immediate circle. The one time you went to Frankfurt in the year, you connected with agents and publishers, but other than that, there was no conversation that you could actually listen into. We had to subscribe to physical copies of Publishers Weekly to know what was happening in the West or in English language publishing elsewhere. And it was all a kind of learning by trial and error. So I joined Penguin in 1996, and I had a brilliant publisher in David Davidar. He was a pioneer in the trade publishing business in India. He created a way of working based on what international trade publishing was then. And he put together editors, he put together systems by which we actually figured out how to commission books, how to publish them, how to edit them. And we would, now when I look back, it's really funny because we used to make offers based on like 2,000 copy print runs to the best of writers. We might write to Jhumpa Lahiri's agent and say, and we can print 2,000 copies at rupees 250 rupees, and we are happy to offer you 20,000 rupees as advance. And it was absurd, but it was a reality of Indian publishing. And the miraculous thing is that everyone would say yes. And we would publish all these great books with very little money, with very little resources. And when I look back, I also realized that Penguin was probably the only publishing house then that people really knew about outside India. So they didn't even scout for other publishers. They would just sign up. And you could find writers in ways that you read something somewhere and you could track the writer down, and they would probably not have been approached by a publisher ever. So they would be happy to talk to you. I remember once, there's a journalist called Binu John, who's based in Delhi. Binu sent me a mail one day with saying, read the story, it's a great story, maybe you should talk to the writer. It was a lovely story that had been published somewhere in some magazine. It was by a writer called Altaf Tayarwala. And I read the story and I loved it, and then I found Altaf's email. By that time, email was around. And I emailed him, and he was 25, 24, something like that. And he was working on a book. And it took a couple of years, but a book happened. Similarly, Avtar Singh, I remember Monisha Mukundan, who was editing the ITC magazine then, had published a story of his. And she said, you should go and talk to Avtar, he's such a brilliant writer. So off we went and met Avtar Singh and said, we had no clue what we were doing, I think now. We had no models to work with, we had no idea how books are actually created, but we had our own theories and we did them. And so we went and met writers and things happened. I remember once, again, somebody sent me a story in The Atlantic. It was a brilliant story, and it was by a writer called Akhil Sharma. I'd never heard of him. But again, we found out who he's represented by, wrote to the agent, and suddenly I remember in the Penguin office, I got a call on the landline, and I went and answered it, and there was this very American-sounding voice on the other end saying, my name is Akhil Sharma. I heard that you wanted to talk to me. Do people in India read? Do people in India, why are you reading me? What is it? Like, he had no clue what the Indian reader was like. He was zapped that somebody in India had read it. And I said, well, we read it in The Atlantic, and that was, of course, a shocker. He was really nice about it. He was just that he was so curious. And then he said, well, actually, I'm writing my first novel, and my agent will tell you more about it, etc. And An Obedient Father came out about, I think, a year later, and Penguin got the India rights. The thing is, it was a very different time when you had a near monopoly, and writers were keen to understand what was going on in India. They didn't know any better. Agents didn't know. We had to keep telling them, yes, we publish in English, not Indian. They didn't know there was nothing called Indian, that there were many languages in India. It was like a full, you had to educate them first into what had to be done before you could get something, signed up with them. So I think it went on like that a little bit till Arundhati Roy. She was the big point of, I don't know what to call it, rupture or just remarkable progress in one step. But the moment Arundhati won the Booker Prize, I think everything changed. Suddenly, everyone wanted to know about Indian writing. They thought India was full of these brilliant writers who were going to write these wonderfully exotic novels, and they were all going to win prizes. And suddenly, Indian writers, young Indian writers or Indian origin writers, were getting very large advances based on, mind you, not a whole book, but sometimes on proposal, sometimes on a single chapter. And a lot of those books took a lot of time to come out later because there was nothing there. There was just somebody who said, oh, agents are looking for Indian writing, let's write a proposal. And so some books happened and a lot of money was earned and things changed. I think it was not that there weren't writers before who were famous and who had made it around the world. There was Vikram Seth, there was Ghosh, there were other writers. But I think with Arundhati, it was that she was seen to be a homegrown person. She'd lived here. Her experiences were all within India. She was published in India by a publishing house that was born just to publish her. So it felt as though she had made it entirely on talent and storytelling abilities. And, there were some who said she was beautiful too, but that was just par for the course. But it made such a difference. It also made a difference in the sense that it seemed to be established that this was the kind of literary fiction that should be published and that writers should write. So for a while, everybody in India, I think, was trying to write the novel about Kerala, about beautiful things, about, slightly sort of derivative fiction happened. And a lot of mid-list work got published because there was the hope that this could be the next big one. And then I think Chetan Bhagat happened. I think Chetan had to fight so hard. Arundhati must have fought too. I'm sure she had her troubles along the way. But Chetan had to fight to be taken seriously. Chetan had to fight to be published. He had so many critics that it was difficult for him to even stand and say, I have written a book that I want you to read. And yet he went out and he did what he had to do, and he marketed his books and he found ways to make people read them until he was indisputably the best-selling writer in India. And we saw what happened after that. Multiple books, bigger sales from hundreds and thousands. People started to actually say, there are lakhs of readers in India. We never knew there were lakhs of readers in India for English. And suddenly they were there. And all because of this one man who kind of went out and broke the rules and transformed everything. This is where I come back to the fact that people will still say, is it all right to publish books like that? I think it's perfectly all right. I mean, why would you not publish books that work for readers? And then it got another sort of impact happened along the way, which is Bollywood came into the picture. You had Three Idiots, you had big cinema coming out of a book. I mean, Slumdog Millionaire had happened too, but this again was homegrown. This was an Indian writer, an Indian movie, and the revenue was substantial, profits were substantial. Suddenly, it wasn't just Sidney Sheldon ruling the bestseller charts, or Robert Ludlum, or Jeffrey Archer. It was Indian writers. You look at the bestseller list now, and maybe most of you are just too young to remember that there was no bestseller charts for some time ago. But now that there are, they're all mostly Indian writers. You might have Amish, you'll have Chetan, you'll have Durjoy, you'll have Ravinder, Preeti Shenoy, Arundhati Roy, thankfully too. But it's, in the last 10 years, it's completely changed. Which means that where you had to write a certain kind of novel, suddenly now you can write many kinds of novels, because you don't necessarily have to be an Arundhati Roy, you can also be one of these others. You can write mythology, you could write romance, you could write other kinds of fiction, and you knew that there were readers. So there was a whole new energy that came into publishing and into the kind of people that also came to publishing. I think one of the problems with publishing, and continues to be actually, is a complete lack of diversity. I mean, there are people like me in publishing, and then there are people like you and you and you and you, and you're all alike. We're all alike in many ways. We have the same sort of education. We come from the same sort of families. We read the same sort of things. We think we have similar tastes most of the time. We don't read very different things, and we don't think other people would want to read those different things. Which is why when Chetan came to publishers, he was rejected for the most part. Rupa took him on, but the others rejected him. Amish came to publishers, everybody rejected him. Ravinder Singh was rejected in the first instance by big publishers. We didn't know, we did not recognize. And I think we didn't recognize it because we had no idea that this too could be an English that could charm people. We didn't realize that books didn't have to follow a certain way of telling and packaging to make sense to readers. It's not very different now. I think we have a few more people who try and do different things, but primarily, I don't think people are wrong in saying publishing houses still are of a sort, mostly. So probably things will change, but let's see how that goes. But so there was Chetan, there was Amish, there's all these people who've suddenly taken on the mantle of bestsellers and publishing stars. And then, of course, we had the big shift, which was retail. Again, I don't know how many of you remember that there were only neighborhood stores at one point. There was no Crossword, there was no Landmark, there were no big places where you could go and buy books. And you know, the thing that makes a difference between having that neighborhood store and a big chain is something that maybe people don't realize is important, which is to get multiple copies of a book into a store. You go to a small store, you go to Select or another store like that, you have a bookshelf, you have 10 new books that have come out this week, you can keep one copy of each, right? You can't keep 10 copies of each. But then suddenly you had Landmark and Crossword, which had very nice big shelves, which they had to fill, and you could send 30 copies, 40 copies. And suddenly you had what had never happened before, which is you would walk into a store and there would be these piles of copies of books. Automatically you tended to gravitate towards them and say, if it's so popular, if there's so many copies being kept, there must be something about it that I need to know as well, and then you would buy a copy. So that entire visibility of the book changed. the idea of walking into a bookstore, like say a Kemp's Corner Crossword, and going to Moshe's upstairs and having chocolate and coffee, it became lifestyle. It became a different kind of trend that was sought to be talked up by people. So again, marketing changed. Everyone started to say, now, who are these people who are reading? Let's capture them. Editors, store recommendations came up in the stores. You remember those little stickies they would put up saying, read this, read that? And that too changed. I remember standing in Kemp's Corner in Bombay one day, and this lady came up, and she was talking to this shop floor guy, and she said, I want to protest, I want to complain. So I looked back to see what the problem was. I thought a book wasn't available. But she was protesting because a popular book was in one of those big shelves that said store recommendations, and it was a popular romance. It was a well-known writer, but it was a writer that obviously was not literary. And she said, you can't do this. You're a store, you're responsible. You can't tell people to read this book. It's got typos in it. And she was very agitated. And the store manager was like, I don't know what to say. He didn't know. He wasn't even a manager. He was just a boy on the store. So it was like that. There was a time when, this was agitating a lot of people, this fact of what can be, what cannot be, what should be sold, what should not. But I think now what we've done is we've leveled out. Whatever kind of writer you are, if you're working on any kind of subject, and especially non-fiction now, which is like the big market now for books, there's been very big, very popular narratives that have completely changed the way people read non-fiction in India. Dalrymple, Ramchandra Guha, all of these writers have brought that to the forefront. Things have leveled out. So you have every kind of shelf, you have every kind of interest taken care of. We can unabashedly say we publish across the spectrum, and there's good reason to do that. And readers can choose what they want, and there is no difficulty with that. There is, of course, the point of format as well. Increasingly, there's talk about digital versus physical, but it's not really happening at the moment in India. We're still physical book buyers, physical book readers, and ebooks are a very small percentage of what is selling and what people are reading. So it hasn't changed that much, but I think all the changes that have happened have been for the best. I think if Anita is able to write a literary novel, The Better Man was written many years ago, and it was entirely a literary novel. I mean, I would define it very happily like that. And now you can write Inspector Gowda, and there are readers of it maybe a different kind, maybe the same overlapping readers, but they're there for that as well. And so it's an exciting time to be writing, I think. It's an exciting time to be publishing. There's a lot of translation work happening now from the different languages into English, English to other languages. And the whole ecosystem has become much richer, much more forgiving of mistakes. You can take risks. You can make your money in one, get back in another that you believe in. You can publish poetry because you also publish commercial fiction. The balancing act that every publisher does, it's becoming more and more the thing to do and to manage to sustain. So there's that kind of excitement. There's also, of course, the one last thing that I must mention, which is that just like the free media, just like academic institutions that are fighting in many ways now, I think publishing is also sometimes under siege. Not always, but occasionally it comes under siege. You find books that are pulled back. You find a stay in court because there's been an extract of a book that somebody protested about. You find that there is a great, not need, but there's a great temptation to self-censor, because really, do you want to get into trouble? Do you want does the writer want to get into trouble? So at one level, the writer is already self-censoring, and then publishers and legal teams will also suggest changes that perhaps need to be done. But I think in India, publishing is still standing its ground. I think people are fighting, and they are willing to take those risks as to put out books against the establishment or whatever, government, whatever else that they want to do. And writers are getting the support they need to do that. So if there is something that we need to probably watch carefully as we go along, it is this aspect, that are we going to still be free to do what we do? Are we going to be allowed to publish? And are you going to be able to write what you want to write and get away with it? are we going to see ourselves pulling back because really it's easier to publish romance and not get into trouble? Why would you publish a book on Modi or Godra or all of those other things that we want to publish on, but not everyone wants to see published? I think there are a lot of brave people in publishing who do not do what is expected of them only. I think they break the rules. They try and engage actively in the debates around them. It's difficult sometimes because you are a publishing house that takes maybe 8 months to publish a book, and today's debate is not easily captured today in a book. It will be 8 months before you do it. So you have to be nimble, you have to move quickly, you have to find ways of participating and staying relevant without compromising. And that too is something that will take some seeing, we'll have to see how it goes. Whether more international publishing houses will make a difference, will online sites like Amazon and Flipkart make the difference? Because recently when Sawendra's book was banned, it was clear that the government of Jharkhand might stop copies in the stores from selling or being displayed, but you couldn't stop someone in Delhi or in Bangalore from ordering it online. So I know that a whole lot of people immediately ordered the book off the online space and got their copies delivered to them. So much for the ban, right? So there are ways in which you can counter all of the stuff that's happening, as long as you know that physical safety is not something to be concerned about. And there too, I think, wherever there's random things like hurt sentiments causing people to go to court and so on, publishing houses have to pay the money or employ the lawyers or whatever to do what needs to be done. And writers, most importantly, I think have to just be with it and to say that they're going to continue to do the long form writing, not just write a column where you just say what you have to say and move on. To take on that ambitious project, like say an Akshay Mukul writing a book on the Gita Press. It took years of work. And finally the book that is produced is a book that will stay forever, I hope. There are writers like Raghu Karnad who took many years to write a book on India and the World War, but he did it. And there are grants now which support writers. The whole community of writing has more support than it used to have. So I think it's a pretty good time for you to be a writer. It's a great time to be an editor. And it's also a time when I think we can make meaningful interventions in what is going on around us. It's not just about publishing books that we love personally, but about saying if we publish this book, it might actually make a difference to someone. It may not change a life, but it may change a few things about that, or in that moment it may make some difference. So it's well worth it. So I guess that's really all I wanted to say, that I'm delighted to be here, to know that Anita's been telling me about all the writing that's happening in the course. And we hope that we will work with some of you at least. And I'm also very, very happy to say that we just recently decided to publish a work by a writer who last year, Kripa was here, 2 years ago. First batch, there was a writer in the first batch, Kripa G, who's non-fiction and fiction. She's been working on both formats, and Ajita and I have just been working with Jaypriya, who's representing her work. So it's like a nice time to say, you write, it represents, we edit and publish, and Anita brings it all together. So Anita'sAttic, I think, is a great idea. I hope it just goes on for a long time. Thank you for having me here.